Space Force became a new service on December 20th, 2019, and a few weeks later in January, it was put to the test when Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles at US and coalition forces in Iraq. Earlier, I spoke with C4ISRNet's Nathan Strout about his exclusive story, highlighting how Space Force's 2nd Space Warning Squadron at Buckley Air Force Base, Colorado, saved lives. Nathan, welcome. Walk us through what happened in Iraq in January 2020 and how Space Force took part.
Yeah, so on January 7th, 2020, Iranian forces launched about a dozen ballistic missiles at US and coalition forces based in Iraq. And what happened is that personnel from the newly established Space Force, formerly airmen, members of the Air Force, who operate a infrared sensor on orbit on satellites, were able to detect those incoming missiles and give an early warning to troops at that location to seek cover. And Space Force leaders have credited that early warning with saving lives.
Now at that point, Space Force was new as a service. Was that unit built from scratch in a few weeks, or had it been an existing military unit beforehand?
Yeah, so in essence, Space Force is a rejiggered version of Air Force Space Command. So these personnel, the squadron that we're talking about, they were an Air Force squadron beforehand. So really we're talking about a name change. The Space Force had just been established, and this first year has really been about organizing. So the difference on the ground is not as substantial as you might think.
So even though it was an existing unit, it's still a remarkable feat. It's also impressive that they could monitor such an attack. What kind of technology was involved?
Yeah, so shortly after the attack, we learned that it was an early warning system that had given this early warning. We weren't sure what system that was, but we had some suspicions. Space Force eventually confirmed that it was the Space-Based Infrared System, so SBIRS. This is a constellation of about a half dozen satellites up in geosynchronous orbit that use infrared sensors to detect basically, infrared signals anywhere on Earth. So these things are monitoring the globe 24/7, every single inch of the Earth, detecting anything that's going to look like a ballistic missile launch.
So is SBIRS, the space-based infrared system, used only to catch missile launches, or is it a general use system?
It'll pick up anything, right? So a wildfire, they're going to see that. Ballistic missile, the launch of a satellite into space, regularly scheduled thing, that's going to get picked up by these satellites. Really anything. But this system can kind of give the operators an idea of what missile's being launched, what type, where it's heading, given the information they need to let people know what's inbound.
So it's impressive that they pulled this off in the first few weeks of its existence. What has Space Force been up to in the year since?
Yeah, so the Space Force has started swearing in new members, setting up their headquarters, getting an idea of what their organization is going to look like. They've established the first of 3 sub-commands that are going to sort of form the big organization of the Space Force. They put out policy documents. Really, this first year has been about organization and setting up what it's going to look like over the next few years. As far as systems and people on the ground, a lot of it's been a strong continuation of what Air Force Space Command looked like.
Okay, so Space Force is now more established, and this happened more than a year ago. Why is this story important to tell now?
Yeah, I think it's the perfect story to sort of exemplify what the Space Force does versus what we think the Space Force does, right? It's not some sci-fi organization. They're not going into space. They're not flying starfighters. They're working on the ground. Their bases are in America. This squadron is based in Colorado. They sit behind monitors. They control the satellites. They process the data that comes off them. So this story kind of exemplifies what they do and the actual real-world implications of their capabilities.
Nathan, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
You can read Nathan's exclusive story on c4isrnet.com. And now for defense industry headlines. The U.S. Army is heading into a culminating event used to evaluate 4 different unmanned aerial systems capable of replacing the service's current tactical UAS, the Textron-made Shadow. The service will hold a rodeo at Fort Benning, Georgia, the last week of February through the first week of March. Taking part will be all 5 of the Brigade Combat Teams, or BCTs, that spent the last year evaluating future tactical UAS systems. That's according to Brigadier General Wally Rugen, who's in charge of Army aviation modernization and recently spoke to Defense News. The Army will brief senior leaders attending the event on the data that resulted from the evaluations the BCTs did in 2020. The 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division was the last to wrap up its evaluation at the end of the year. Each unit was provided just one of the candidate systems, so the rodeo will bring each of the aircraft back onto one playing field. Coming out of the year-long evaluation period, Rugen said that he was hopeful that the Army would get a revolutionary, not evolutionary, new tactical UAS capability that isn't tied to a runway, has a lower acoustic signature, and far lower equipment requirements in order to transport the system within a unit. The US Army is evaluating Israeli defense companies Rafael's shoulder-launched, short-range version of its Spike missile and demonstrated the capability at the Army Expeditionary Warrior Experiment 2021 in January. That's according to a statement that added that it was the first live-fire demonstration of Spike SR on US soil. Rafael's Spike SR is a portable, electro-optical, anti-tank guided missile. It fits into a family of anti-tank guided missiles, including a long-range version and a non-line of sight or NLOS version. The US Army has purchased an interim set of Spike NLOS missiles for its aviation fleet to urgently bring a precision-guided munition capability to its formations. Spike SR weighs some 22 pounds and has a range of about 2 kilometers. The US Defense Department announced that it awarded a $30.4 million contract to boost domestic processing of light rare earth elements as part of an effort to become less dependent on China for critical technologies. The Pentagon awarded the funds to Lynas Rare Earths Limited, the world's largest rare earth element mining and processing company outside of China. The firm will use the funds to open a processing facility in Hondo, Texas, through the Australian company's US subsidiary, Lynas USA. The award is part of a broader push by the department to secure its rare earth supply chain, which is threatened by China's dominance in the industry, and move more production to the United States. China is the top producer of rare earth metals, which are a critical piece of defense systems like satellites or the F-35 fighter jet. That's all from around the defense industry this week. When we come back, we'll get tips for military members on managing credit card payments. And later, we'll hear from defense news reporters on stories they're tracking in 2021.